Good evening. I'm Alexander Lokey. I am trying to graduate from the University of Maryland, Baltimore in a master's in TESOL. Um, this summer I was approached by Mary Taba because she had a potential job for me with the University of Maryland, Baltimore Writing Center, where they have a population that exceeds 50% in non-native English speakers. And since it's a graduate school, a lot of these writers need help just tweaking some of their writing skills in an efficient amount of time under their program. So I responded and I met with Jocelyn Broadwick, who is the head of the Writing Center, and she asked me to provide a 6-hour training course for their instructors. I naively said yes, but I managed to come up with a very strong training course for 18 instructors at the University of Maryland, Baltimore Writing Center. It's taken me a lot of time to revisit this topic because it has been mentally exhausting. It was the hardest thing I've ever done in my entire life. It started out, I just did some work, did a little bit of research. I talked to Professor Laura Hook, and she really got the ball rolling with where I need to start and where I need to finish. And the ultimate goal was create your objectives, create a survey, put these statistics together, develop some sort of method that complies with the 50-minute programs of the Writing Center, and finally, put some workshops together. So it seems pretty easy. So 6 hours of talking is not what I will be doing right now. So let's begin. If you'll excuse me while I check my notes. So one of the questions I asked the students before we started was, why are we here? And this is a direct quote from one of the surveys. I am interested in helping maintain the essence of the ESL's writer's work while maximizing clarity and finding ways to help learners accomplish that. I did a little bit of research and I came to the conclusion that in all writing centers, there's a rift between what is most important when it comes to providing consultation for a writer. And it is to first focus on content and organization, and then address the grammar and the punctuation. The quality of the writing is in the content and organization, and the grammar and punctuation really do take a back seat. The problem is this does not satisfy the needs that a lot of ESL writers need to obtain. And I know we all live in this world where ideally, if you can get into grad school, you should be able to write a proper sentence. But grad school is very esoteric, and it is very challenging, and meeting the requirements for a standard, sorry, there's an ambulance outside, for the standards of graduate quality work is very difficult, especially in the limited amount of time that we have. I'm just going to pause this until Baltimore City, ambulances, Johns Hopkins, got the best hospitals in the world, but anyway. So this is the clientele that exists in the University of Maryland, Baltimore, and you can see the Korean and the Mandarin population is exceedingly high compared to the rest of the students that, that require help. So that's one thing I kept in mind. What are common problems that exist with Korean writers and Mandarin writers? A lot of them called themselves Chinese, so I just added that together. Then we have French, Japanese, Persian, Farsi, Arabic, Amharic, Spanish, Mindi, Hindi, and Yoruba. And here's a beautiful pie chart of all the information involved. So I decided to give an opportunity for these writing instructors to at least get a schematic background of the processes that are required to learn a new language. And as Krashen hypothesized, in many hypotheses, one of 6, that motivation, aptitude, and awareness are some of the key semi-quantifiable tools that are needed to proficiently obtain and acquire a new language. So something to keep in mind with this is that you're born with this. You can't teach motivation, aptitude, and awareness. You can improve it, but you are kind of born with these skills. So as instructors, you really want to optimize what you can, but understand that it's also not a failure if you're not completely salient in the time that is allowed. But motivation, aptitude, and awareness are usually the underlying flames that get the fire started, the pilot fire, to learning a whole new language. And that you can see in learning a new instrument too. So the first question I pose to these instructors is, what is rhetorical awareness? Well, how would you explain this sentence? What happens, happens. Now, what's the main verb? What's the secondary verb? What is the what? What are the parts of speech? What is the tense? What is the grammar? How do you explain this? Is this idiomatic? Is this efficient? Is this literal? Okay? So I give the instructor some time to workshop this, and we spend some time figuring out what happens actually means, and I write on the board all the suggestions, and these are the ones I could come up with. But the fact is, there's a logical fallacy behind what happens, because there's no quicker way to say it and more efficiently. But does an ESL student have this almost idiomatic understanding that this is how we say something in this context? So what is to happen will happen. What could happen may happen. What could happen will lead to the inevitable next sequence of events, or to which happens, meaning what happens will happen. And it's very exhausting, and we could go on for another 25 minutes about this, but I'll continue. So the crux, we get to the actual problem of being an official writing center with a high ESL population. And you can see here that to maintain the integrity of a writing center, they almost have to step away from their main principles. So you can see here, they need to focus on content and organization. Well, let's get to that. How can we do that when, I'm going to go back, how can we do this properly when students need help with the grammar and the punctuation and the word formatting? So what did I do? I came up with an ESL toolbox. 3 different types of methods that instructors can apply in this time frame. Now the time frame of this program is that they have 50-minute blocks that they can spend with these students, and that's it. So it's really hard to even read these blocks or read these papers and address a prioritized sequence of effective instruction. So we start with the first workshop, defining friendship, and it's from a student that I had. And in partners, we pair and share. The instructors read this student's paper, and just off the top of their heads, I ask these instructors, how would you approach this paper? And I give them 25 minutes. After we discuss certain ways to actually ameliorate some of the issues with this paper, I give them the mission to provide academic writing instruction to ESL clientele under the professionals at the UMB Writing Center and its mission. Instructors will employ the necessary and practice skills and techniques of writing center instruction while guiding ESL writers through academic content and organization, still sticking to the principles, while also employing tools, the ESL toolbox, to increase rhetorical awareness through holistic and self-evaluating grammar instruction. Going back to rhetorical awareness, what is the shade of meaning that is most exact to the native writer? How can we imbue that into a non-native English speaker? So here are my objectives. To maximize the effectiveness in academic writing for ESL clients, we will expand the instructional scope of rhetorical awareness and competency. We will help explain the importance of language roles in English, and we will guide the client to an optimal proficiency in writing by asking the client why language may be inconsistent. So we hearken to the actual writers about where they think they had the most trouble, and to optimize the 50-minute time slot given for each client. And then I give them a background on what it is to be an L2 academic. And this is the PRISM model of what it is to be social and cultural while learning a whole nother language. You have language development, cognitive development, and academic development. You also have the motivation, aptitude, and awareness. And this all comes from Thomas and Collier from 1997. And these are the 5 stages that exist in language acquisition: pre-production, early production, speech emergence, intermediate fluency, and advanced fluency stage. And that's where we are. It's very nice to talk about this, but we're going to move quickly. But we're focusing on making few grammatical errors, continuing to learn new vocabulary, and having a high comprehension of the linguistic material. So what are the strategies that need to be elicited? Well, begin to provide grammar instruction, continue to emphasize vocabulary, focus on reading and writing skills, using sheltered English, scaffolding, and cooperative learning techniques. So scaffolding and fundamental techniques of teaching never cease in any stage of language acquisition. But there's still a problem with learning language, and we're going back to Krashen with one of his 6 hypotheses. He states the effective filter hypothesis. When you are in another culture, you do have a dropout where you just kind of feel an anticlimax and maybe a little depressed. And these are impediments on learning another language. Hopefully you don't have any questions. So, what do? We now know that there's a long process involved with learning a new language, and hopefully these students are at the end of this process, and we're just tweaking the little tiny parts because these are advanced writers of English. So first we're going to start with the itinerary. This is what you do with your 50-minute block. You follow the formula, which we will get to, like what to do with your 50 minutes. Go into the session thinking of the ESL assurance insurance policy, which I will also discuss in a couple slides. This is my coined term. Focus on clarity, content, and organization, so do not betray the principles of a writing center. And then use my ESL toolbox. Pick a couple rules and just roll with them. Then the final aspect is to underline any issues that are absolutely glaring, and then ask the student, where do you want to start? Together. Then you will diagnose the problems. You'll provide resources and discuss. And hopefully you can get that done in a 50-minute time slot. So how do we regiment the time? The first 5 minutes, get to know your client. That's as simple as just saying, hi, how are you? Where are you from? Maybe diagnose their ability of English. Now, speaking is not always indicative of writing ability. But if you ask, how are you? Where are you from? How have you liked your experience in the United States? Try to ask different tenses of grammar just to gauge your student's ability. All right? Then you read and address content and organization. That's going to be the next 25 minutes of reading. That's just pure reading, and hopefully you're a fast enough reader to read, and you probably don't actually get through the whole paper. That's something I learned from the Writing Center after the fact, that it's really hard to get through the whole paper, so many clients need to follow up. Whether they do or not, that's up to the client, but most of the time instructors just go through certain parts of papers. So find the part that they want to start at. Then you ask the student, what do you think needs focus? So you use the ESL toolbox to forge out the ESL common functional problems. So the total formula is underline the problems, ask what do you think needs focus, diagnose together, provide the resources which UMB Writing Center has, but I also have given a few resources myself, and then discuss and practice the common problems. So first, getting to know your client. We already discussed this. Ask a few questions that will force the student to not speak in such a rehearsed manner and to kind of change tenses. Read and address the content and organization. Kind of just talked about that as well. Focus on the good parts, or focus on the parts that disrupt the comprehension of the reader. Ask the client, what do you think needs focus? Employ the skills from the toolbox. I cannot emphasize enough. Underline the issues. Ask the client. Let them know why it's incorrect. Provide a resource and allow the client to practice. And again, feedback from... Sorry, I just got a terrible... Feedback is key. There's a lot of controversy as to the magnitude of efficacy that is involved in feedback, but you gotta give your student feedback. Moving on, this is what I coined as the ESL Assurance Insurance Policy. This is, hey, you might be frustrated that your ESL student isn't understanding the problem. Don't worry, because some of these problems exist. This, you can take this assurance insurance policy with you and rest assured that, hey, sometimes it's not completely salient. So these are the three biggest problems when it comes to overcoming a language acquisition process. Fossilization, phrases, and collocations. Now, phrases and collocations kind of go together, but these are the biggest hindrances I find when it comes to rhetorical awareness. I define fossilization as when interlanguage occurs, inaccurate behaviors are learned and employed, and then they might not ever overcome that. So the key is to kind of nip it in the bud before it happens, but can you? Phrases. Phrases are very difficult. One of the examples I like to use is look at the wall, look up the information. These two verbs are accompanied by completely different functional parts of speech. Up acts as a particle, and it's not a preposition. It's a particle of a phrasal verb, while at is a direct prepositional combination of look at. It's a direct, literal, directional command. Now, these phrases need to be understood. There's got to be clarity in that. And last, with phrases, we have phrases involving blocks of time. Over the next few years, each and every day. These are problems that exist because it's very unnatural for a non-native English speaker to understand these phrases. They would probably miss one or two, it's just really hard to understand over the next few years. So the best way to help them is to show the correct form if they're trying to say that. And then phrases with parts of speech, again, applied to, look at, disappointed in, unhappy with. Prepositions are the last parts of speech that are usually acquired when it comes to language acquisition. And phrases have prepositions so much. And then transitional phrases, which are so important for writing, especially academic writing. Firstly is terrible. During time in China, terrible example of what not to do. And then finally, collocations, like a big old truck. Why do we say it that way? Why do we have an inherent adjectival form of communicating things? A big, beautiful dress. Why can't it be a beautiful, big dress? So, with collocations, we have idiomatic expressions, mistranslations, and vocabulary. And of course, vocabulary is the bedrock of communication. So what does it mean when we have mistranslations? It is a huge hindrance when a student tries to translate an idiomatic or a collocative phrase into English. As Chomsky says, it messes up concept, meaning, and interpretation. For example, the word cool. Cool has a different metaphorical meaning than it does a literal meaning. And it can be interpreted in different ways, and they both carry two different concepts. So what are we trying to say? We need to find the perfect shade of meaning. And I have a few examples. I had one student who wanted to say today, or when I showed up for class, you have a twinkle in your eye. I think that's what he was trying to say, but that day he said, you have beautiful eyes this morning. And then that same student would end his emails with sweet dreams. And I just think that's so funny. And then finally another student I had who asked me, why do you mash potatoes but you don't smash potatoes? And before I got really into it, I just said, listen, we have smashed potatoes and mashed potatoes, but it's just the verb that is nuanced and a little different when it comes to the process of cooking these potatoes. And she had a revelation right there on the spot, and she said, oh, I understand. It's because you can't break a potato, and potatoes do not have bones. And I don't know what went through her mind, but she understood mashing and smashing differently. And then idiomatic expressions, spill the beans before they kick the bucket. I would try to stay away from them. So, finally, the last part of the insurance policy is vocabulary. Emphasize the correct vocabulary. Not the eloquent vocabulary or the loquacious vocabulary, just academic shades of meaning is the key. So what will this insurance policy do? It will enhance your instructional awareness. It will serve to remind you that these errors are hard to remediate. You will know that these errors can't be fixed without exposure, explanation, or direct instruction. And know that these clients may never overcome these issues, and that's not your fault. Any questions? No. Then we do another workshop. This time, there are errors in this workshop, this essay that we do, where there are important errors and insurmountable errors. And they're in the appendix of my final paper. So then we move on to the ESL toolbox. What's in the toolbox? I've broken down this toolbox into 4 methodical approaches that you can go when it comes to providing resources for your ESL client. And these are the most common errors that exist in these demographics. I did a lot of research on this. I have isolated grammar. How can you fix that? What is it? I define all of these, so I'll get to that in a second. Methodical grammar, content and organization, and instructional competencies. So how do you use the toolbox? First, while you're reading, just mark something. Then underline the bigger issues. Then ask the student, where do you want to focus? Then diagnose the errors together, provide the resources, discuss, and practice. And that is what you need to do in your 50 minutes. This is the toolbox. Open it up, provide the resources. So, starting with isolated grammar functions. Isolated grammar is the simple grammar that can be fixed quickly, and here are 9 issues that are glaringly prevalent in ESL academic writing. Misuse of articles, misuse of plurals, and count and non-count nouns, especially abstract ones. Adverbs, huge indicative elements of rhetorical awareness and efficiency is how well you can use adverbs. Relative clauses and pronouns, gerunds and infinitives, transitive versus intransitive verbs, transitional words and phrases, verb phrases, and causative verbs. Now, I entered this training course thinking that I would be teaching very, very intimidatingly professional writing instructors, and a lot of them weren't sure what half of these grammar terms were. That's not to say I was disillusioned, but I should have provided a little more of a definition for each of these. But let's start, okay? I define these, and then I go through a quick fix, all right? So misuse of articles, going home, going to bed, going to the hospital, grabbing a drink. How do you get it all right? And some of these questions I wouldn't know unless my students hadn't asked me, why do you go to bed, not to the bed or to your bed? All right? So we always need to emphasize that we quantify everything except abstract non-counts. Even singularity in the abstract phrases. There was a beautiful sunrise, not there was beautiful sunrise this morning. Misuse of plurals. This is as simple as just telling an ESL client that, hey, if you're generalizing anything, we pluralize it if you can count it. For instance, I love dogs. I can't say I love coffees, but I love dogs. I love these houses. Okay, anything. Then we have count and non-count nouns. I provide a list of abstract count nouns. There are 8. I think there are actually 11, but I included these 8. Abstract ideas, school subjects, little parts like jewelry and sand. Collective nouns referring to things like clothing, equipment, furniture, minerals, liquids and gases, and measuring words are another thing. James Rutledge of St. Cloud University actually has a ton of information on rhetorical awareness and rhetorical efficiency, and he's the one who states that adverbs are the biggest indicator that rhetorical efficiency and awareness hasn't been realized. Adverbial placement calls for particular cases of accuracy for clarity to eliminate ill-formed sentences. An ESL instructor should note the significance of teaching adverbial placement to students not only for the sentence clarity, but to develop rhetorical awareness. Okay? What's a good example of that? He quickly put out the fire. He put the fire out quickly. This isn't super necessary to teach to an ESL student, but a native speaker will understand that there is a slight change in manner regarding that sentence. I remember telling the truth sincerely, and I sincerely remember telling the truth. Okay? Slight shade of difference in meaning. So that's a common confusion. How can you fix this? Show the adverb visuals chart, which is in my ESL toolbox booklet that is in the appendix of my final paper. And just to make it a lot easier, I will give you the table of contents page right now. That starts on page 21. Okay. Relative clause is another thing. This can also be a brush up for the instructors. My sister who lives in LA is a photographer. My sister who lives in LA is a photographer. The way you say it, the way you write it, to the native speaker and reader will see that there is a defining clause in there and a non-defining clause. One indicates that you have 2 sisters. Another just indicates that you have 1 sister. My sister who lives in LA, not my sister who lives in Florida, is a photographer. My sister, who just happens to live in LA, is a photographer. 1 sister there. So how can you get these students to understand relative clauses? Get them to try to explain something. Ask them, what is an astronaut? Oh, it's a man who flies into outer space. Okay? I lost that thing that you need to control the television. Oh, the remote control. All right? Another thing. Transitive versus intransitive verbs. This is just a common problem that exists. You just can tell them if it's a transitive verb, it means there is a what and a where, and then provide a list of verbs that require what and where and what do not, and then some require both. I work out every day. It's the same thing. Next is gerunds and infinitives. Okay, that's something that is important for vocabulary. So what are the quick fixes? I say gerunds are real and they are in the past. Infinitives are unreal and they are in the future. I need to remember to lock the door. That's the future. I remember locking the door. That's the past. One is real, one is not real. I remember shaking Obama's hand. That's real. I want to remember to shake Obama's hand. That's unreal. Another thing to add when you're teaching gerunds and infinitives, which are so hard to teach, is that they follow certain verbs. And then these are just a few verbs that you can use. Transitional words and phrases, oh, they're such a problem for people. Explain how these items help the flow of logic. All right, there's a great resource that I have in the book. Verb phrases, another thing. Look at. Common confusions, quick fix. Give a detailed list of phrasal verbs is really the quick fix. Like this. Take for, take in, take in, take in, take off, take off, take off, take on, take over, take over. This can all be provided by the Writing Center. And then finally, the last part of isolated grammar is causative verbs. That's something it took me 4 years to realize that students have had trouble with this type of verb that I've never known the name of, and it's a causative verb. And you can, they're so important when it comes to discussing academic changes. Like you could say the market went up, it went down. But also with causative verbs, there are even better synonyms that can be used. So the problem with causative verbs are that a lot of students, kind of like phrasal verbs, don't know that these verbs exist. Many languages have a verb that is almost prepositional. For instance, in Portuguese, you can say, I can through the door. Well, we have to say, I can go through the door. So this is something that a Portuguese student needs to realize, that you need to put a verb before through. Now, what's the verb? Go, walk, make it? I don't know. I mean, it's up to you as the instructor. But these are very common causative verbs. Get, make, have, help, let, and go. The key sometimes to rhetorical awareness is giving the awareness. And finally, error analysis. So, I'm just going to read this. I can't believe what happened to me yesterday. I was walking with Joe, and he persuaded me to play a joke on Michelle. We took her backpack. Then we told her it was stolen. But we made a mistake and took the wrong bag. The one we took belonged to the teacher's daughter. The teacher made us to say sorry to her daughter. Then she forced us tell Michelle about the joke. It was really embarrassing. I'll never let myself to listen to Joe again. All right, where do you start? Where do you end? Next is methodical grammar. So next is methodical grammar. This is more grammar that is about sentence structuring. It's not isolated where the entire sentence makes sense except for one wrong little bit of grammar. This is the sentence structure is inhibiting the content and the organization of the paper. So these are a few things that an instructor should know going into dealing with an ESL student. And that is independent versus dependent clauses, the formula involved in English, clause order, and verb tensing. So the third thing, well, everyone knows you need a subject and a verb to complete an English sentence, essentially. But the one thing that a lot of teachers fail to add is that they need a complete idea. I speak. That's a pretty broken sentence, but it has a subject and a verb. You need to complete the idea. So that's one way to get students to understand that, oh, your sentence structure is methodically incorrect because you didn't complete your idea. How do you do that? It starts with independent and dependent clauses, which goes into clause order. How do you do that? Where does the comma go? Well, the comma comes after the dependent clause, and usually a dependent clause is missing a subject or a verb. Okay? So that's just something that's really important to keep in mind when you're teaching a student. Last is verb tensing. one wrong verb really does change the whole aspect of time, and time is how, I mean, language is predicated on how we articulate the time and space around us. So it goes with the simple present, simple past, future, present progressive, present perfect, and past perfect. These are good concepts, but what the heck does past perfect really mean? This is where I go to my mentor, Dr. Nelson. I have no shame putting forth his work in here because this man taught me so much. And I said, well, why don't we give Dr. Nelson a little bit of a spotlight for him to show what he was trying to accomplish when it comes to eliciting clarity that's more intelligible for an ESL student. So the three things that we need to look at as instructors is when an action occurred, whether the action continues, or whether it happened before. And here is the tenses that he can provide. The simple tenses, the continuing tenses, the before tenses, and the continuing before tenses. Through the future, the present, and the past. This is something that is so visual for an ESL student to see. To us as native English speakers, I think it can come off as a little jarring. But so is the idea that present perfect, to say that that's not a jarring term with a loaded concept is also a fair statement. So the third workshop goes into another essay where this time they focus on the isolated grammar and the methodical grammar. Some of the sentences in this essay have terrible sentence structure, while others just have isolated grammar. And then we ate lunch. This is my favorite part of the ESL toolbox. It's the content and the organization, and whether Kaplan is politically correct or not about some of the terms he uses, he does have a strong assessment when it comes to patterns of written discourse, and this has kind of been disproven since 1966, but I still like to give a visual that the structure of an academic English paper is linear and direct. And we know that, and we know when it's not. But we also need to know that schematically, we have 4+ other cultures coming to here to write in English, and a lot of times they've been taught differently when it comes to proving a point or providing evidence. So we have the Semitic, the Oriental, Romance, and Russian. And then I just discuss their methods of debate. And a lot of instructors were taken to this. So, I guess when it comes to content and organization, the writing instructors of University of Maryland, Baltimore Writing Center, they're the professionals. They know what to do with the content in their organization. But maybe part of the key that you can help just to galvanize your proficiency as an instructor at a writing center is to explain the importance of why a certain structure is needed. I tell my students all the time, direct. Direct, direct, direct. Cause, effect. Cause, effect. So with content and organization, these are 6 things to keep in mind that are common issues impeding rhetorical awareness when it comes to academic writing. Number 1, understanding the structure of an academic essay. 2, maximizing language with the power of 3, another thing I coined. Establishing a main idea per paragraph, citing sources, word choice, and wordiness. Now, understanding the academic essay, talking about a macro structure. Is it focused? Is it developed? And is it organized? These are the 3 things you need to look at when you're doing content and organization for an academic essay. You can help these students strengthen their thesis by asking stimulating and guiding questions. How can you make it better? Set goals for them. Maximizing language with the power of 3. Okay, my students hate providing evidence. They hate backing up the points they are making. So I say, all right, guys, let's just use the power of three. You can back up and support a reason with a detail as simple as a quotation, a statistical analysis, and a cause or effect relationship. Now, quotations are a little tough because you probably have a quotation that you want to use from another language, from someone who inspired you, and you're going to try to translate, and that can be a little iffy. But it encourages, if you get students to look at English quotes, it's just such a thought-provoking and culturally ingratiating experience that I love doing quotations with my students. And when a student actually uses a quotation to support a detail, uh, I it's part of the joys of teaching for me. Statistical analysis, giving a stat and then explaining it, and then the cause and the effect relationships that could occur when you're trying to create a point. Another option is the onion trick. Just keep going out further and further and further. And then these are some cause and effect relationship examples like vocabulary, organization, logic, and connectors. So communicate the main idea in each paragraph. I'm just ironically quoting someone. If you can't explain it to a 6-year-old, you don't understand it yourself. And that was Einstein. So students need to know that each paragraph has a new main idea. A lot of times you get a big dense paper and you need to chop it up into actual paragraphs because the main ideas are all accordioned together. So if they can't summarize their paragraph, they probably need to slow down and try to figure out the main idea of their paragraph. And when you're trying to get to that point, you need to get these students to produce a speech that will garner more English and get to the points they're trying to illuminate. Citing sources. Plagiarizing is such a problem with ESL. One time I had a student write about the city of Long Island, and it was just a copy and pasted diatribe from urbandictionary.com. And it really broke my heart. So as a professional writing instructor, citing sources is key, and showing that it's so vital is key to rhetorical awareness and maybe the methodical structure of citing a source. Everyone hates citing sources, but it's so important. Word choice, emphasizing the proper vocabulary. Give them options, rephrase when you're asking a question, give them synonyms. But try to find the perfect shade of meaning, but let them choose. Parts of speech are your best friend too. A lot of times students don't know that you can say communicate in like 5 different ways. Communicating, communication, communicate, communicator. All you have to do is just change the suffix. Suffixes and prefixes are so overlooked when it comes to academic writing and using proper vocabulary. Like one good practice is doing a vocabulary game, a suffix game, a prefix game. And then wordiness. Trimming the fat is such a key for writing academically. Stay simple and direct, avoid redundancy, eliminate empty words, eliminate verbs with prepositions, and reduce clauses to phrases and phrases to single words if you can. These are the principles from the University of Alabama Writing Center. And then the 4th workshop is a much harder one, but it focuses a lot more on content and organization with lots of wordiness, terrible word choice, and no supported details. Finally, the 4th part of the ESL toolbox is instructional competencies. And that is, how will you operate yourself as a functional professional instructor at the University of Maryland, Baltimore Writing Center? Right here, these 5 principles. Prioritize the workload, underline, ask, share, provide resources, and discuss. Only focus on serious errors, promoting long-term success, and anticipating common ESL errors, and that's always been everyone's favorite. So how do you prioritize what's most important? Well, first you got to focus on the content and the organization. Then determine the most important errors by underlining them and giving the students time to say, this is what I want to focus on. Why is it like this? What is this? Are there more resources? All right? And then read through the mistakes that do not interfere with your understanding, because that is a big problem for a lot of writing center instructors. They don't know where to start. Underline, ask, diagnose, provide resources, discuss. I cannot emphasize that enough. That's the first animation that's actually worked so far on this presentation. Only focus on serious errors. And McAndrew from 1984 said, follow the high order of content and organization and the low order of grammar and punctuation. Grammar still exists, so find the glaring parts. Ignore mistakes, focus on errors. Guide them through the errors and ask thoughtful questions. Promoting long-term success is emphasize the assignment, emphasize the content and organization, stay simple. Remember that the key is to improve, and to improve the writer, not just to improve the paper, and give feedback. Finally, emphasize vocabulary. McAndrew also said that without grammar, it would be hard to communicate. Without vocabulary, there's nothing to communicate. So, give them time to answer. Do not be afraid of the silent period when you want to elicit a certain vocabulary word from the student, because that will also promote long-term success when a student has to challenge themselves to actually register and keep the information. And then finally, anticipating errors and the cultural difference. So we will discuss that. These are the most culturally specific common errors for 5. With Koreans, they do impossible tenses. She's eat broccoli. I'm expect a good time. Misuse of tenses. The definite and indefinite articles. They don't exist in Korean. I go to the school on Friday. I go to the church on Sunday. I go to the house after church. That's over-intuiting. All right? She lives husband. Missing prepositions or pronouns. Articles don't exist. And then with Mandarin, confusing prepositions, omitting or inserting articles. Verb, tense confusion, singular, plural, noun confusion, and subject-verb agreement. That's kind of common with a lot of places, with a lot of languages. French, the present perfect continuous. That's just an issue they have. Slight meanings between concept and meaning and interpretation with words like actually, which really means recently. Who, they have trouble with who, and they have trouble with the word enough. Japanese have trouble with quantifying much versus many. They have trouble with idiomatic expressions. They have past and present participle verbs like boring versus bored, interesting versus interested, and then incorrect verbal aspect. And then Arabic run-on sentences, redundancy, Arabish, which is like English and Arabic put together, punctuation and writing organization. And then we do the final workshop. So, in essence, this has been a very expedient form of my final project, which is to enhance rhetorical awareness and rhetorical efficiency in academic writing for the University of Maryland, Baltimore Writing Center. And it went fantastic. So thank you so much for listening. Thank you for your patience. And if there are any questions, please ask. Thank you.